Air.
Welcome all, and I've really looked forward to. I guess you joke about this all the time, but we have people in Oslo here, and to you, I would like to say welcome to the other side. And I would like to welcome Pamela Z. Some of us met her on Wednesday. Pamela is in Norway to do a lot of things, talks, workshops, concerts, and she also put up a beautiful installation here in Trondheim, which we are very happy about. I will also say that this session is sponsored, the WoNoMute is sponsored by NTNU and the University of Oslo, which is great. And hello to the people who are following us on stream. And Mari, hello to Mari in Oslo. Who will curate in Oslo? Yeah?
Yeah, welcome to all of you. It's so nice to see that so many of you can come today.
Yeah. Beautiful. Okay, Pamela, last time some of us met Pamela, she was talking about her instruments and how she works with the instrument and voice. And today she will show us about, sorry about my English, she will talk about her big amount of work with not only this live improvisation and live electronics, but also her works with mixed media and scenic works, and yeah, you have a lot of things to talk about. So let's get on with it. Thank you. Pamela Z.
Thank you. So hello, and on both sides. Oh, now I hear a strange little, yeah. Sorry about that. I thought, so today I'm not set up to do any live performance. So I thought that what I would do is a combination of talking to you and showing you little snippets of work samples so that you understand the context of what I'm talking about. So my work as an artist has sort of, I would say that in the early days when I first started being a professional working artist, that it would have been very accurate to refer to me as a musician. And that would have been an adequate term to describe what I do. But over time, I've become an extremely hyphenated artist. And so that when people ask me what should I be called in the catalog or in the program or whatever, it's often like composer, performer, sound artist, performance artist, you know, many things, video artist, installation artist, all of these things. Um, and they're all sort of different fragments of my work, but they also all kind of work in a weird way together. And what I found that has happened is that over the years, I keep adding things to my practice. I don't tend to subtract. You know, since pretty early on, I continue. So, for example, I would say starting in the early to mid 1980s, I started doing work for voice with live electronics. This is processing usually with a lot of digital delay and some other multi-effects processing on my voice to create these pieces in real time that were sort of voice and voice with layers of voice. And since I started doing that, that's kind of been the almost the base of what I do, and everything has sort of sprung from that. And I have never really jettisoned that. I've just keep adding more layers. What happens is I go out and I see other work and I get very inspired. And then I'm like, oh, I want to add some element like that. I really love this idea of having something theatrical. So then the work becomes more theatrical, or I becomes more involved with some more lighting design or set design or movement in the space. And then I see work that has beautiful visual elements, and then, oh, I want visual elements. And so then I get involved in that. And over the years, all these things just keep coming in. At some point, I was asked to make a piece for a gallery installation. and I built a sound installation that was a multi-channel sound installation. And I had done some fixed media work, like for radio pieces in the past, but that was the first time that I actually had made an installation that was shown in a gallery. Um, and then after that, I just really got the bug, and I really wanted to make more. I really wanted to be more involved in the visual art side of things. And I started making pieces that involved sound embedded in objects and projected image with combined with sound and so on and so forth. At one point, a friend of mine saw an exhibition catalog that had my name in it, and she called me up and she said, I, did you stop playing music? I see now that you're a visual artist. And I said, oh, no, 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 I'll never stop playing music. I just keep adding more things. so, so that's kind of been the way that my work has kind of mounted and sort of expanded, but without not shifting so much as just expanding. I'm just going to show you a little very short bunch of excerpts from some live work because like I said, the basis for all the work that I do, or sort of maybe the most the core of my work for many years has been this work with live voice with processing, and in a performance type setting. So this is just some examples.
Exchanging polite greetings and talking about your country, where you live now. Talking about your family members, visiting Japanese friends or acquaintances.
So that's just a kind of just a collection of little snippets from various performance pieces, and I think they were mostly labeled, and you saw that it was sort of over a span of many years that I picked samples from. Most of those were just solo concerts that were in either a small like performance gallery or a little concert hall or theater space where it's just basically me and my rig basic rig, which is just my MacBook Pro and some gesture control instruments, and sometimes I'll have maybe a single channel of video projected that's projected behind me, sometimes not. And those are the sort of the concert works. And those pieces, I developed a sort of a large body of those kind of pieces, and they're all really short, almost like pop song length, like maybe 5 minutes each. Some of them 4 minutes, some of them maybe 8 minutes. And so I'll just select a group of them and make almost a set list and perform them in a concert. So that's sort of one way that I work. There was one excerpt in the middle of all of that that was from one of my larger, more theatrical full evening length works. And it's a piece that was called Gaijin. And I made that piece in 2001, and it involved myself and 3 Buto dancers, Japanese Buto dancers, and multiple channels of projected video and a set design and lighting design. So it was a big sort of a theatrical piece, and it was a full evening length performance work. And over the years, so I did these sort of small concert type pieces that I was telling you about up until about in mid 90s, where I started to get restless and wanted to do these bigger works. And so I started developing these large scale performance works. The first one I made was I completed it in 1998. It was called Parts of Speech. And it was all about language. And so the trick for me to making these large scale works, because to go from being somebody who builds these really small little 5-minute pieces and then strings them together to make a concert, to making a full evening work, was I figured out, I can work in a very modular way. So I would make big pieces out of a bunch of little pieces. So I would create these little segments that segue one to the other, and that they would all be built around some kind of conceptual idea. So in the case of this first show that I told you about, Parts of Speech, the whole idea was it was all about language. But I deliberately chose a very open-ended subject matter so that it would be easy for me to make a piece that addresses that from all different angles and just explores language in a lot of different ways. So there was no linear storyline or something like that. It was more all these just little vignettes. One section was about small talk and just playing with these little phrases that we say to each other mindlessly when we meet. Another section was about the language of asking. And in that section, to build that section, I actually went out in the streets and I recorded homeless people asking for spare change. And then I took those recordings of these voices asking for a few coins, and I juxtaposed them with the language from big foundations who are asking for donations from very wealthy people. And I kind of put these things side by side and compared that language of asking. I made a whole nother section that was just about the perceived differences between the way women speak and the way men speak, and so on and so forth. So I just was exploring language in different ways in all the different sections of that piece. And I was so happy with that format of just having the freedom to make a lot of little segments that all just play with language in some way. So the next piece that I made, that was a large scale performance work, was a piece called Gaijin. And it was all about the idea of being a foreigner in the place where you actually live. And so I made that piece after returning from a 6-month residency in Japan. And so in that piece, I decided I would work with other artists, and I had involved all these movement artists. I had these Buto dancers, and you saw a little excerpt from that. And so every section of that piece was also just exploring the idea of being a foreigner or being an alien, and all the different ways what that could mean, And I continued making pieces like that. I made another one called Voci that was just all about voice and playing with this idea of voice from many different angles. Um, about 8 years ago, I made a piece called Baggage Allowance. And baggage allowance was sort of exploring the idea of baggage, not just thinking about travel and what you carry in your suitcase or problems that you would have with the TSA security or whatever, but also just in a bigger way, just thinking about baggage like attachment and emotional baggage and all these other ways that you can think about baggage. So by the time I made that piece, I had come up with this way of working that involved interviewing people. And so what I would do is whatever the piece I was making was about, I would formulate a list of questions. And then I would bring people one at a time into my studio and have them sit in my little recording booth. And I would make an interview with them and get really good, pristine recordings of their voices. And then I would take their answers and cut them up and make like a text collage or build music basically out of the sound of the speaking voices. And that would become kind of an armature for building the whole piece, and all the music that I would compose would be sort of like structured around these speech sounds that I collected. I'm going to show you some little examples from Baggage Allowance. Actually, Baggage Allowance is sort of the most ambitious work that I ever made. And the reason why is I don't know how things are here with artists, but when you're making art where I come from, it's if you're making pieces that are expensive to make, like a big theater piece, you have to raise money and you have to write grants and convince foundations to give you money in order to build the piece. And so oftentimes you're writing these grant narratives that are going to, and then you're going to send them, work samples from other earlier work. But you have to write somewhere in the grant a description of what the piece that you're asking for money for. And oftentimes that piece doesn't exist yet. So you're kind of making stuff up. And you're and you're writing this grant and you're putting all these details in. And actually, I think some ideas that are in my pieces have come directly from things I thought of when I was trying to raise money to make the piece. And I was like, oh, yeah, that is an interesting. Maybe I will do that. But I remember when I was doing a fundraising for Baggage Allowance, I don't know what came over me, but I wrote this grant that was I was saying things like there's going to be a full evening performance work with multiple channels of projected video, my movement through the space, voice and electronics, objects with sound embedded in them, all of this on the stage. And it's going to be a full evening piece. But then, not only that, also in addition to that, I'm going to make a gallery installation that's going to have 7 objects that have like sound and video embedded in them, and they'll be shown in galleries. And it'll be like another iteration of the work. Instead of the theater piece, it'll be this installation. And then if that wasn't enough, I was like, and I'm going to make an online, like a browser-based version of the piece. And it won't just be like online documentation of the performance. It's going to be its own iteration of the piece designed to be experienced in that web environment. And so I submitted this crazy grant, and lo and behold, I got the funding. And then it was like, oh my God, now I have to do all of that. And so I did, and it took several years, but I accomplished it all. I'm going to show you a few little short excerpts from the performance version, which premiered in San Francisco at a theater that used to be called Theater Artaud, after Antonin Artaud. It's now called Z Space, no relation. It's a theater. There's a theater company called Z Space, and they've taken over that theater. But so that was where it premiered in San Francisco, and then in the New York, the New York premiere was at the Kitchen. And so this little excerpt video I'm going to show you has just some snippets from both of those two performances. Okay, here we go.
Use caution when opening overhead bins. Items may have shifted during flight. Unknown person, unknown person, unknown person, unknown person, unknown person, unknown person. Did you pack your own bag? Unknown person. Did any unknown person ask you to carry something? Person, unknown person, unknown person. Has your bag at any time been out of your immediate control? Person, what is the purpose of your travel? Unknown, 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 unknown.
2 pants, 2 or 3 shirts, camisoles, maybe another jacket, a vest. I usually always have a vest.
Either warm or wet clothing, 1 or 2 pair of blue jeans folded, and sometimes a pair of pajamas.
1 or 2 skirts, 1 pair of dress pants, 1 pair of jeans, maybe 1 sexy nightie, depending on what's going to happen.
Socks.
And socks.
6 pairs of socks. Just enough socks and underwear.
See, I almost forgot the socks.
So that's excerpts from the live version. And in that piece, I was using quite a bit of different elements. As you could see, there was a big projection that was about 20 feet wide, rear projected, so that I could actually at times walk right in front of the projection without casting a shadow on it. And then I had this, it's a little hard to see in the video, but there's this big, it was about 12 feet wide semicircle that basically, so this bat, you had like I forget I'm talking to a camera and I got to stay in the camera, but you had like, the big screen, and then you had like a little, almost like a little platform in front of it that was about 4 feet high I could walk along. And then tipped off of that platform down to the floor was this big semicircle that looked like half a donut. And so that would change to being different things throughout the show. But there was a couple of places in the show where it became a bag carousel. So on that semicircle, you'd have the bags going around and so on and so forth. So it was kind of complex set. And then I also had other screens, and I had multiple channels of video projection, plus I even had like a film projector, an old film projector that was projecting on one of the surfaces. And then I'm moving around in the space, and I had objects like trunks and suitcases that I was manipulating. And I was using my gesture control instruments, which you saw a little bit of in the video. And I don't know whether or not you could tell, but I was also using the sound of my voice to manipulate the video at times. And so, for example, I'll just show you a little example of it. This section here, when I was pulling the suitcases, was video that I shot out the train window when I was taking a train in upstate New York at some point. And so that footage came just from my phone. This is very grainy out the video window, but it looked like this. Oh. So you can see it's, I'm, in that case, I was just doing, it's a very simple thing, but I kind of like it. It's this nice, you know, you have this Gaussian blur and then things come into focus. And the sensor I'm using for that is just the microphone on the computer. And it's picking up the amplitude of my voice. And then that's deciding to bring the image into focus whenever it hears amplitude. So sometimes I have little touches and elements like that in the pieces. So before I even made the performance work, I had to build the installation that I had promised I would do when I wrote that grant. And the reason I had to do that first is because I had an actual date for an exhibition. There was a curator who used to be at the Brooklyn, the Brooklyn Museum in New York. And he had been asking for a long time if I had any installation pieces that he could show. And then at some point I said, oh, well, you know, I'm working on this baggage allowance piece. And he said, well, let's do that. And then all of a sudden it was like, okay, so your exhibition starts in January. And I was like, okay, I guess I have to build it then. So I was like feverishly creating that piece in the fall of 2009 to have it ready by January of 2010. And I'll show you a little bit of footage from just documentation of that. Oops, that's not it. We just saw that. Where is it here? Here's the installation. Okay, so the first exhibition, this guy from the Brooklyn Museum, by the time he programmed me, he had moved jobs and he was no longer at Brooklyn. He was in a museum called the Krannert Museum in Illinois. And so this is actually the Krannert Museum in it's outside of Chicago. And so there were 7 pieces. He gave me a whole gallery, and there were 7 sort of media pieces, and they were sort of throughout the gallery. That one was called Sonic Suitcases, and then this was Tape Loops. And so as you enter the gallery, the first thing you encounter is this thing called the bag X-ray. And it's had a belt on it, just like at the airport. And the patrons, when they came into the gallery, were asked to put their bag on the belt, and then it would go through. And I had designed the software to grab an image of their bag and then insert objects that they didn't expect to find in their bag. And so I created a whole database of objects that were sort of size. The computer would decide based on the size of their bag. So there were weapons. There was actually a chest X-ray with a beating heart, an Emmy Award, live animals, even tools, just all kinds of things that they didn't actually have in their bag that would suddenly appear in their bag when it went through the X-ray. So that was bag X-ray. And then this piece here was called the Weeping Steamer Trunk. And it was an antique wardrobe trunk. And I don't know if you know, a lot of people may not know this, but people used to actually travel with these wardrobe trunks. And they weighed 75 pounds empty. It was like furniture because it had drawers and it had like a place to hang your clothes. And so people would go on these long trips on boats, and they would take, you know, their clothes in these things. And so I found this old steamer trunk, and I embedded sensors in it so that when you close the drawers, you would get the images would change I put a display in the lid of the trunk. And then also I put actual objects in the drawers so that when they would open the drawers, they would actually see things inside. And some of them were just innocuous things like a pair of gloves and a locket with a picture of my parents. And, you know, but then it got a little stranger. Like this drawer has a tiny, tiny little model of a Victrola. And then you could hear, like, when you open the drawer, you could hear like the surface noise from a vinyl record and an opera singer in the distance. And then here was a drawer that was completely filled to the top with hair. And then this drawer was, there was one drawer that was just filled with old family photographs and so on and so forth. And each drawer would have image that would appear in the video as well, and sound that they would hear when they open and close the drawers. And I called it the Weeping Steamer Trunk because one of the drawers, when you open it, the trunk just sobs. And it just cries unconsolably. So that's why I called it the Weeping Steamer Trunk. This one right here, I called Suitcase. And it's probably my favorite out of all of them, even though it's not it's pretty simple technically how this piece was made, but it was really affecting to people for some reason. It's a very small suitcase, just about 20 inches wide, maybe, and when you walk up to it, you see that there is a woman sound asleep in the suitcase. And if you lean really, really close, you can hear my voice muttering and whispering, kind of worrying all the stuff, the thoughts that you have when you can't get to sleep. And so that's like embedded in a speaker that's inside the speaker, but the suitcase, you have to get really close to hear it. And then every once in a while, she wakes up and looks right at you, which was very startling to people. But people found this this to be at once kind of charming and actually creepy because and I think it had to do with the scale, because the suitcase was really only big enough for like an infant, and yet there's this grown woman asleep in it. So there are several other pieces, like I think about 4 more that I haven't shown you, but I'm not going to go through all of them because I don't want to use all the time on this piece. But that was, there were throughout the gallery, there were different pieces, all with sound and image embedded in them and having something to do with baggage of some kind. So that was the baggage allowance installation. And then I am not online, so I'm not going to show you this, or maybe I am. Oh, I actually am. Well, let me just see if I can bring it up really fast. If I can't, I'll give up. Oh, no, I can't do that because I'm not sharing in that way. Never mind. Yes?
It's just because I can't see that much. Is it possible to have the art pieces in the screen?
Oh, I don't know. That would be a question for these guys, and I have a feeling that's too big of a shift in the middle of the proceedings. Sorry about that. I'm sorry. So I'm not going to show you the online piece, but actually there's the browser version of the piece is the one that sort of remains in perpetuity, and people can go and visit it. To this day, it's still there, and you can go visit it at will. You can just go on your own browser. The only problem is that it was written, I made this piece in 2010. Actually, it's getting to be 2011 by the time I got to the browser part, but a lot of Flash programming was used in the making of it, and I don't know how much. I see some nerds nodding, knowing what I'm talking about, but I don't know how much that means to most of you. But the problem with that is it means that it will not work on iOS devices, so you can't look at it on your iPhone or your iPad or any of that. But you can still look at it on your MacBook Pro or your whatever desktop machine or that you have, as long as your browser has a Flash plugin installed. It's the address is baggageallowance.tv, as in television. Baggageallowance.tv, and you just go there and dial it up, and then it's a little place for you to go and roam around and sort of find your way through and explore, and things that you can interact with and play with there, including a working version of the Weeping Steamer trunk that you can actually open the drawers and get in, get inside and so on and so forth. So so that's the third iteration of the piece, and that still exists online. If you have Flash, you can look at it. I am not set up to show it to you right now, but anyway, so baggage allowance, that was sort of a big deal for me because it was a piece that kind of took me a couple of years to complete, and that's a couple of years after I was really working on making the piece. Like there were a couple of years before that where I was thinking of what it is and planning it and fundraising for it and so on and so forth. But yeah, so I made quite a few pieces. I've made some other full evening performance works since then. I made a piece recently called Memory Trace, that's all about memory and various things like that. I want to talk a little bit about my use of language in work. So you heard a little bit of it in Baggage Allowance, where you could hear this collage of people speaking. In one case, I was using list of things that one of the questions I had asked people was, what do you take with you? What's in your suitcase? Just describe to me everything that's in your suitcase when you travel. And so then I just am a person who loves lists, and I built little sections out of just these lists. And I often do that. The other thing I really love about making a bunch of interviews and then using the material to build music is that if you ask a bunch of people all the same questions, even though they're not in the same room at the same time, there's always at least one or two questions where everybody says the same thing. And then I end up with all these samples of different people's voices saying the same words. And so then you can build like a chorus of people speaking a certain word. And it just sounds wonderful, as if they were all, as if they were all in a chorus together, even though they were never in the same room when they actually spoke those words. There's also a lot of musicality in the human voice. And in any voice, in any sound, actually, a lot of people think if you ask anyone, you ask the average person, like, what is the difference between singing and talking? I think a lot of people would probably say, well, with singing, there's pitch, and with talking, there is no pitch. But actually, that's not true, because there are no sounds that don't have pitch, because sound is waves, and waves have frequencies, and pitch is frequency. So whatever the frequency is, there's your pitch. Now, sometimes those frequencies are so random and there's so many of them clustered together that it's hard to sort of pinpoint one fundamental tone. But what you find with speech is if you take a little snippet of speech and you start looping it, it only takes 2 or 3 repeats before you very clearly begin to hear the melodic material that's there. And so I, not unlike a lot of other contemporary composers, because I think that with the advent of sampling technology and the ability to make digital recordings and make small clips and easily, very quickly loop them, I think many people simultaneously discovered this. But there were people who were working this way even before we had all this digital technology, people like Steve Reich, who used to do it with tape loops. But now there's just a plethora of people who, in the contemporary music community who have made works where they're working with the pitches that come from the spoken text. But I'm going to play you this very short, just a couple minute long example of how I like to play with text. And this is just a study for the piece I made called Memory Trace. And some of this ended up in the piece, but this is kind of the first thing I made when I was working on it. The first thing I did was just start interviewing everybody I could find. And I was on an artist residency when I started working on the piece. So all the first several interviews I did were all the other artists who were in the residency program with me. And then I was interviewing the director of the program. And then I interviewed the groundskeeper and whoever I could find. And I then used their voices to start building some text collage. And so this is a little study at the beginning when I first started working on Memory Trace. And there's no image to this. It's just sound. That's not it. It's here.
But I can't remember.
I can't remember that.
I don't remember.
I don't know what I was doing exactly.
After that,
Well, yeah.
Remembering.
I can't remember.
I'll remember.
He remembers. He remembers. He remembers. He remembers. He remembers coming towards me.
I
remembered us.
remember.
I remember.
Oh, I can't remember now.
Wasn't sure that I remembered my boyfriend's.
Form or shape.
Well, yeah.
And an apple. And an apple. And an apple.
And there was a green apple.
And an apple.
And there was a green apple.
Apple Store. Got in my iPod Touch.
And
there was a green apple.
And I we passed my
Two or
and
three.
I we passed my I dreamt, and it was drizzling.
A clear memory. Absolutely.
Yes.
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 Absolutely.
Yes, I make lists
I love lists.
I certainly make plenty of
I
lists.
always
They
write
make
lists
keep all those
They made
lists.
3 lists.
for making lists.
I go through
definitely make
periods of my
lists.
life where I don't have lists.
I am notorious for making lists.
I was in a car on a slippery slope.
I was in a plane and it started going
Before
down.
that, I was painting.
And I was with my sister.
Couldn't really prove who I was. I think I was like 12. I was about to leave a comfort zone of sorts. I was sleeping on the floor. I was sleeping on the floor. I think I was like trying to call my dad and prove who I was. I think I was
Confused about why I was coming here.
I was a spy in a past life.
I don't know what I was doing exactly.
After that,
Well,
Then,
yeah.
Remembering.
I can't
They all
remember.
remember.
And I'm going to fade out there, but one of my favorite things in speech sounds is when these in between sort of placeholder noises that we make, like the those sounds, because they're sustained, and so the pitch suddenly becomes really pronounced. And then if you cluster those, you get these beautiful tone clusters that sound like they're singing, chords. So I play with that kind of stuff a lot. I know that we're getting short on time, and I want to make sure there's some time for questions and answers. I wanted to just show you one other, because it made this big lead up with talking about the way I'm using text. I composed a work for Kronos Quartet recently. Well, now it's not that recently anymore. It's about like 2012, I think. And the piece was called And the Movement of the Tongue. And it was all about speaking accents. And so what I did for that one was I interviewed many, many people who had different, speaking English, but with different accents, either different American regional accents or different accents from other English-speaking countries, or people who spoke English as a second language and had an accent from whatever their original language was. And I then took all of those little samples of their speech and I built a text collage, kind of like what you just heard, that became the armature for this piece that I composed for Kronos Quartet. And I'm just trying to find the file because I'm skipping forward past other things here. Sorry. So it was a long piece, about 23-minute long string quartet that I wrote for them, for string quartet and tape, as we like to still call it. But it was made up of a bunch of little micro movements that were all like a minute long, 2 minutes long, and so forth. And so I'm just going to play you one little 2-minute movement from that, which is the first movement. But I'm just having a hard time. It was right here, and now I can't find it. Hang on. Craziness. Why is it? Oh, there it is. Okay. So this is the first movement of the piece I made for Kronos Quartet. And you can kind of hear how I was working with the sampled voices. And there's no video, it's just a still. Can you turn it up a little bit? Volume up.
Born. I was born. I was born. Born.
I was born.
I was born.
I was born.
I was born in
Ireland.
I was born in Japan. I was born in
South Korea.
I was born in Fort Smith.
In Western Australia.
I was born
in
I was born in Paris.
My father was born over in Berkeley.
I was born in Oakland, California.
In the Netherlands. Wyoming. I was born in Houston, Texas, and my mother was born in Los Angeles.
Born.
I was born in Leeds.
Born.
I was born in Paris, France, northern England.
I was born in the state of Kerala. I was born in South India, city of Shilling, North Carolina.
I was born in Mexico City.
I was born in Memphis, Tennessee.
I was born in Houston, Texas, Long Island.
I was born in a very, very small little town or village, almost in southern Sweden, called Laholm.
So that is just the first movement of and the movement of the tongue, which was the piece I made for Kronos Quartet, and that piece was because it was written for string quartet and tape, or actually it's a track, stereo track that plays back at the same time that they play. In order to play in time with the speech part, the quartet has to wear earbuds and they have to listen to a click track, so that they are playing in time, so that they don't get all out of sync with the tape part, because there's a lot of places where the notes that they're playing have to sync up exactly with the music that with the speech that's on the tape. So I think I'm going to open up for questions and answers. I wanted to say one other thing though, which is that for those of you who haven't seen it, I have an installation here in Trondheim, and it's at this museum, at this gallery called Tex, and the installation is called Sonic Gestures, and in the version of it that is playing here is in 6 channels. I originally created, oops, I'm sorry. What did I do that for? I originally created this for a space that had the ability to show 10 channels. And it was a completely surround situation, so that you had 360 degrees of these images around you. But the version of it that is at Tex, it looks very interesting because in the original, these were projections, very large projections, a big room that had 10 channels of projected image. But this new exhibition is the images are being shown on displays. And so the images are really crisp and the displays are very shiny, which means that there's a lot of reflection, which ended up with kind of an interesting artifact where it created a kind of a depth in the space that I wasn't expecting. So just, I wanted to give you a little taste of what that looks like, but you should go and see the installation if you have the chance. So I think maybe here I'd stop and, yeah.
HTT_extreme.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's just so strange that I talk in a microphone and I don't hear. Yeah.
But someone hears you.
Yeah, someone hears me. Absolutely. Hello, Oslo. Thank you. It's so great to have you here. It means a lot. And now for the questions. We can start with Trondheim, and Mario will take over in Oslo. Any questions here from the audience? Yeah.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. So just wonder, when you were showing these examples with voices, what is the process to identify clusters? Do you use software or just listening to the material?
Okay.
What is the kind of
so I start in Pro Tools, and so I record these. I record directly to Pro Tools, and then the process. So I end up with, often there'll be as many as 30 interviews that I do. And those interviews can range in length from like 15 minutes long to sometimes they get as long as like 45 minutes long. So in the end, I have hours of material. And so then the next process after conducting the interviews is listening to all of those. And the way that I do it is I just sit there and I play them. And as soon as I hear a sound that I like, and these can be entire words or entire sentences or just phrases or just syllables or even just phonemes. But I hear something that jumps out at me as like, this is a nice little building block, a little piece of sound that is going to make something nice. I capture that as a clip or a region, and I name it. And I end up at the end of that process with hundreds and hundreds of named regions, and the regions are called Julie, Richard, or so and so, shh, or whole word, whatever. I try to name for myself exactly what it is so later when I go to pull them, I can recognize what they are. And then I have multiple tracks in Pro Tools and I start building them. And if you look at my Pro Tools session, it really almost looks like architecture because it looks like little building blocks. You see like all these tracks and you see these little colored squares that are all shifted in different positions. And I just kind of sculpt the sound using all these little pieces, sometimes full phrases, sometimes just little snippets of words. But yeah.
Mari, anyone in Oslo wants to ask a question?
Sorry, I don't have much voice today. A really nice, inspiring lecture. I had a question about a lot of your work is using a lot of technology, but the content is very much about the body, materiality, different types of physical things. Could you say something about the tension between kind of the analog and digital, if you like?
Wow. Well, I think that we are all humans and we all have bodies and we all are living in this world, but we also are all surrounded by all of these new devices and technologies, and they become part of the landscape too. And also they just become the tools that you can use to navigate these things. So for me, it's about marrying those things and not as opposed to seeing them as these separate worlds, but putting, just combining them and navigating the world with them like we have to do. And I think that from the beginning of history, we have used technology, but the technology maybe used to be like a stick and with a stone tied to it or something like that. It's still technology, but it's like we build tools and we use tools and we figure out a way to make those tools interact with and to do the things we need to do. And I just think we're living in a time now where we have the definition of what we can consider to be a tool has just expanded. And it's just a natural thing, I think, to just use those tools but you're right that they do have an effect on things. And I'm not trying to pretend that there is no difference at all between using instruments that are made out of wood and horsehair and cat gut or whatever and instruments that are made out of zeros and ones, but it's still an instrument and it's still a way of sort of navigating. And I do think that there's a lot of people who are using this kind of technology and they're basically sitting behind a screen and either stroking a trackpad or clicking keys or twiddling knobs, we used to say. And I think as a performer who does feel like my body is a really important part of my presentation as an artist and as my way of communicating with the audience, I have always strived to find technology that allows me to interface with it through the body, which is why I use these controllers that I can control with gestures or with the sound of my voice, rather than having to always turn a knob or pull a fader or something.
Yes, Trondheim again. Any questions? No? Okay, before I ask one myself, anyone in Oslo?
Anyone? Yeah, one question there.
Yeah.
Yes, when you're working with a new composition, do you get to design or redesign or modify your existing gear?
The actual redesign in terms of the hardware that I'm using doesn't happen as frequently, although from time to time I'm introducing new things there. For example, I have these controllers that I wear on my hands now, and I've been sort of working on those for the last couple years. But what does have to happen with each new piece is that in software, I have to do a lot of programming and a lot of adjusting and creating of presets and things like that. And sometimes new things are introduced into the tools I use because the piece is crying out for it. Like I'll be doing something that I really need to be able to accomplish something specific. And so I have to sit down and say, well, how could I do that? And then through that, like the need for a new tool might arise. But often, maybe just as often, interesting ideas come out of because of a new tool or because of a mistake I make with an old tool. So I have these happy accidents that occur because I was trying to do one thing and I couldn't do it. I was making mistakes. And then suddenly I realized, oh, the mistake is so much more interesting than the thing I was actually trying to do. So
Anyone here? I would like to ask you something. Because and we don't have much time, and it's a big question, I think. But you use a very strong material when you record other person's voices and use it in your music. Especially when you told about recording the beggars asking for money. I just wonder if you wanted to share something about that, because how and have you experienced any conflicts in using that material? Has someone said, I'm disappointed with how you used my voice and so on?
That's a really good question. In all of my time doing this, that has only happened once. And luckily for me, that person's voice had already ended up on the proverbial cutting room floor by the time that I found out they didn't like the piece. But for the most part, I've been very lucky. And I have to say that really when filmmakers do things, where they do interviews and they use people's faces or their voices in their films, they go through a very rigorous process of collecting signatures for what do you call release, the releases. People fill out release forms. And when I make my works, I should do that. But what happens is I often start with just a bunch of friends of mine or people I'm close to, or in the case of the artist residency I was at, a bunch of other either collaborators or just fellow artists who are also at the same residency. And it feels like on such a friendly basis that I just don't even remember to worry about it. And so I have made many, many, many pieces like this without collecting some written release. And by all rights, I should be in trouble. I should be in deep, deep trouble, because with all of those, there should be somebody out there like who's trying to sue me now for having used their voice in a way they didn't want. But I mean, I always make it very clear to people what I'm going to do with it. And they, even though they don't really fully understand it, they've been told what my plan is. And it's so cute, though. I mean, often people, like I'll be interviewing them and they'll answer and then they'll stop halfway through and they'll say, scratch that. Don't use that part because I could said it wrong. Or, I'm like, don't worry. I'm really not going to use most of what you say. I might just be using the T sounds that you made or, but, I had one guy, I made a piece several years ago. This was in the 90s. And it was just when this whole sort of technical revolution was starting in a way. And I had an artist residency at a place in Palo Alto called Xerox PARC. And some of you have probably heard of it because it's very famous. It's where the mouse was invented. And Xerox PARC was this sort of industrial park where it was the sort of research branch of Xerox. So it was much more like an academic campus feeling than like it didn't feel like a corporate, like a company. And they actually had an artist residency program that some guy there who was both an artist and a researcher started this program called PAIR, the Park Artist in Residence Program. And they would bring an artist in and pair them with some researcher, and then they could do projects together, like maybe the researcher is interested in following gesture or facial recognition or something like that, and the artist is interested in making some project about that, so they do something together. So I got one of those residencies, and while I was there, I started I was hearing all these programmers speaking in this geek speak that was really sounded like a foreign language. And they were saying all these words that now everybody in the world knows these words, but at that time it was just the geeks that knew these words. And there'd be whole sentences where there was like, was there any English in that sentence? So I thought it was really fascinating. So I went around to their offices with my little portable recorder and said, can I interview you about, just talking about this language? And so I recorded a bunch of them, and then I made this piece called Geek Speak. And it turned out to be kind of a funny piece, and it had all of these, and it was really interesting too, because it was all bros at that time. It was just like all these dudes, and they were all like, and they all had a certain manner and it was almost like geekdom was a country that they all came from, and they all spoke with that accent, and so I had built this piece, and it had layers of their voices all saying bit, bod, byte, and all these things, and talking about operating systems and blah 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 blah, and I knitted it together to make this very rhythmic, layered piece out of all their voices. There was one guy who I later, after I had finished the piece, I found out that he didn't like the piece because he thought it was pejorative. He thought that it was like making fun of technical people. And I thought it was sort of celebrating them, but he thought it was kind of making fun of them. And so the interesting thing is, I went back and I listened to the piece, and I realized none of his voice ended up in it. Even though I had interviewed him, I just didn't end up selecting any regions from his interview. So I was very lucky because he didn't like the piece, but he wasn't in it. So, and other than that, I've never had anybody be unhappy. I just recently made a piece for a flutist named Claire Chase. She's a virtuoso flautist in the United States, and she commissioned me to make a piece for solo flute and electronics. And I took samples of her voice and built like a text collage of her speaking, and then wrote the flute parts around that. And there was this moment where it was a little awkward because at first she was uncomfortable, because it's just weird to hear your own voice. And she had to like play all these notes that I'd written for her while listening to, her own laughs and her own weird little grunts and sound, vocal sounds. And, but she grew into it, and now she loves the piece. But other than that, I've just been very lucky. But you have a very good point, which is that I really should be doing the releases, because one of these days I'm going to get in trouble.
Okay, we have to close up. No, it's not close down. Yeah, this session. Yeah, the Geek Speak is on Pamela's CD called "A Delay Is Better," which is a brilliant title for a CD. I think. Thank you very much. We also have to say that this, for Trondheim people, this installation at Bakklandet, next to Café Soil, if you know where that is, you should go and sit there and really take it in. It's beautiful. For the Oslo people, please help us to spread the word, because Pamela is having 2 concerts, one with me and Sten Sandell on Wednesday, and a solo show with video and everything at the Vega Scene on Thursday. And we really should let people know that she's here, that she and show her to the world. The links for those 2 arrangements is on the streaming YouTube side now, so you could share it and invite your friends and so on. So then, is there more to say? Mari, thank you. Thank you. And should we just say bye-bye?
Bye-bye.
Thank you
for having me. Thank you. Thanks.